continuing in our study of the life of David, significant events in his career. Let's see, who wants to start reading for us right now? Terry, you mind if
Sure.
you begin 2 Samuel chapter 3. Start with, just read verse 1 for us.
The war between the house of Saul and the house of David lasted a long time. David grew stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker.
That's a rather profound statement, both from the standpoint of history, but also from a spiritual standpoint. And of course, what that relates to, I think, is that my translation is a little bit different. Same message of what Terry said. There was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. The house of Saul representing what?
The flesh.
The flesh, and the house of David representing what? The Spirit, the call of the Spirit. And the idea that it's a long war, I think, tells all of us that it's a long process for the Spirit to finally overcome the flesh. And what we're seeing right in this chapter 3 and beyond, is essentially the culmination of one of the wars, the war between Saul and his family and David and his family, where David finally ascends, if you will, to Jerusalem on the mount. But the idea is, I think that what's conveyed to us here is that it is a long and it's an arduous process. It really is a war. It's a series of battles where the Spirit is constantly at war with the flesh, because the flesh continues to attack and try to get the Spirit off track. All right, Terry, continue on, verse 2.
Sons were born to David in Hebron. His firstborn was Amnon, the son of Ahinoam and Jezreel. His second, Caleb, and the son of Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. The third, Absalom, the son of Maacah, daughter of Tamiah, king of Jezreel. The fourth, Hadjon, the son of Haggith. The fifth, Sephathath, the son of Abital. And the sixth, Ithram, the son of David's wife, Eglah. These were born to David in Hebron.
All right, so we know that at this point in time, David, he's been anointed twice at this point in time. He is the king over the house of Judah at this point in time, and his capital is at Hebron. He reigned there for, about 7 years. And we see here that he had 6 sons that were born while he was at Hebron. All right, read on, verse 6.
During the war between the house of Saul and the house of David, Abner had been strengthening his own position in the house of Saul.
Pause right there. Who's Abner?
He's the leader of Saul's army.
That's right. He was basically Saul's right-hand man. He was his general, we'll call him. Saul has been killed, as we know. Jonathan is dead. So Abner, his story sort of picks up here. And so we're going to be talking about Abner and Ishbosheth. Ishbosheth is who?
Saul's son.
Yeah, the second son of Saul. Saul's first son was Jonathan. He's got a second son by the name of Ishbosheth. So we're going to be talking about those guys. We're also going to be talking about another line here. We all know who David is. David had a general who we'll refer to Joab, and as it turns out, Joab is the son of David's sister, Zeruiah. Okay, so Joab becomes the general. Asahel was killed. Remember in our last episode, Asahel was killed by whom? You remember?
Abner?
Yeah, you remember Asahel was following behind him, just kind of being a pest, not really causing him any harm, and Abner said, just get away from me. And Asahel keeps on following. So what does he do?
He's got a sword.
He's got his spear in his hand, and he kind of butts him with the back end of the spear, goes through his belly, and kills him right there. So Asahel has 2 brothers left, one of whom is Joab, who becomes David's general. So he's one of the characters we're dealing with today. All right, read on.
Now Saul had a concubine named Rizpah, daughter of Aiah, and Ishbosheth, and said to Abner, "Why did you sleep with my father's concubine?"
Pause right there. So here we have a serious accusation. Saul has died. One of his survivors happens to be a concubine, which is, basically an illegitimate wife. And so the accusation is made by Ishbosheth to Abner. He says, "What are you doing taking my father's concubine?" That really is an insult for Ishbosheth to have done that. But as we see here, Ishbosheth is insulted. Abner is insulted that Ishbosheth would even challenge him or make an issue out of this. Read on.
Abner was very angry because of what Ishbosheth had said, and he answered, "Am I a dog's head on Judah's side? This very day I am loyal to the house of your father Saul and to his family and friends. I haven't handed you over to David. Yet now you accuse me of an offense involving this woman. May God deal with Abner, be it ever so severely, if I do not do for David what the Lord promised him on oath, and transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul and establish David's throne over Israel and Judah from Dan to Beersheba." Ishbosheth did not dare say another word to Abner because he was afraid of him.
All right, pause right there. What's going on right here is interesting. All right, because bear in mind, as somebody mentioned last week, Israel is sort of a divided kingdom at this point in time, right? Saul had been the leader, the king of all of Israel. David had been anointed even when he was a young teenager to be the king, but God had not yet raised him up to be the king. We know that there was great conflict for many years between Saul and David. Saul was very jealous of David. David was patient. David had many opportunities to kill Saul, but he didn't because he knew that God was at work. So what happens? David is becoming stronger. Saul's rule, we know that Saul was certifiably nuts, and eventually he's killed. Saul and Jonathan. So the next in line for leadership is Ishbosheth, and in fact, after Saul's death, he is anointed, he is made the king over Israel. Okay? So Ishbosheth at this point in time would have been relying greatly upon the military, right? So he would have been relying upon Abner to lead the troops. So if Ishbosheth had any chance of success, Abner would necessarily need to be right there with it. They need to be working together. But what do we see? Almost immediately tension breaks out, strong tension. And the tension arises from the fact that Abner takes Saul's concubine as his own, which is really an insult both to Saul's memory as well as Ishbosheth. Ishbosheth confronts him about it. Abner just bows up as if, "Why are you even accusing me of doing anything wrong? I have the right to do this." And so what's Abner's response? He says, "If you're going to be that way, I'm going to go throw all my support over to David." So what's going on here? What's going on is God is raising up David. He's raising up the spiritual side, and he's bringing down, he's tamping down the fleshly side. And in doing so, one of the things that God does is he creates the tension between Abner and Ishbosheth, which results in just a weakening, if not a total surrender of that side. Again.
Let's speak in fleshly terms. It's ego,
Yeah.
and it's testosterone going back and forth. Chest bumping.
That's a thumbs up.
Yeah. But interesting.
Both fleshly.
That's right. God is using that. God is using that to accomplish His purpose, right? And His purpose is to humble the flesh, eliminate the flesh, and to raise up the spiritual side. Okay. Warren, you want to read next?
Yeah.
Verse 12.
Then Abner sent messengers on his behalf to say to David, "Whose land is it? Make an agreement with me, and I will help you bring all Israel over to you." "Good," said David, "I will make an agreement with you, but I demand one thing from you. Do not come into my presence unless you bring Michal, daughter of Saul, when you come to see me." Is it Michael or Michelle?
I think it's McCall.
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 Okay. Then David sent messengers to Ishabah, son of Saul, demanding, "Give me my wife Michal, whom I betrothed to myself for the price of 100 for the price of 100 Philistine foreskins." So Ishmael gave orders and had her sent away from her husband, Patriel, son of Lash. Her husband, however, went with her, weeping behind her all the way to Bahurim. Then Abner said to him, "Go back home." So he went back.
Pause right there. So we all remember the story. Saul offered his first daughter to David and then took her back, and then gave Saul his second daughter, Michal. Saul gave David his second daughter, Michal, and they got married. And then Saul took her back and gave her to another man while David was out in battle. So when David first begins to rise in power and Saul's house is going down, one of the first things he says is, "Give me my wife back." Why do you think he did that?
Well, one thing I see in this here is this here, as you read in the Old Testament, you really don't think there's any love between the man and the woman, the way I see it. Because they just take them, they can have one wife, or they can have 10 wives, or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
They just, the way I look at it, there's no courting going on. They just go up there and their daddy gives them the daughter,
Yeah.
and I don't see no love in it. But I do see some love in this here because the husband is going behind it and he's weeping because he's taking this lady away from him.
Uh-huh.
That's the first time I've ever seen it.
Well, I think
Can you
it's,
tell me any other parts in the Old Testament what shows love?
well, I don't know about that, but I think it's through her that David claims right to Saul's kingdom.
Yeah.
It's a political thing.
It is a political thing.
It's a political thing. I think it's an ego thing too. Like, you know, I'm the king now. I'm demanding everything that belongs to me. But
Is that showing love?
well, no, I don't think he brings her back as a result of love. I don't think he was pining after her. He was basically thinking of her as his property. Now that I'm the king, I want all my property back, and everything that's been taken away from me improperly, you know, shame on you, give it back. But the concept of love, I don't think it was ever God's intent that David, or Solomon for that matter, either take on all these multiple wives or all these multiple concubines. I think God's plan for marriage was as with Adam and Eve, you know, one man, one woman. You know, is there an example of what we would say was true love? I don't know. I think of Jacob and Rachel. Jacob, you know, he was really after Rachel. He wound up marrying through trickery Leah. Then he worked another 7 years, and the indication seems to be that he really did love Rachel.
Yeah.
But you know, it's, I guess, very often, particularly with regard to the kings, we see that their marriages are often political. You know, as was the case in the Middle Ages too. You know,
Well,
we know
Rebecca-
European history that all these kings and queens, their children were married off to other royalty throughout Europe. Yep.
Rebecca and Isaac. Even though that wasn't the one that God chose to use in his line, but he really loved her because she bore Benjamin and Joseph.
Oh, that's Rachel.
That's Rachel.
That's Rachel? Okay, I'm getting mixed up. The
But
R's.
Isaac was, Isaac
mixed up.
married Rebecca.
Yeah.
You know, when we were in Spain,
That's
and we went to see Queen Isabella's castle.
Which is where? What city?
It's in Canada, is it? I tell you what, I'll bring you a big thing. I'll show you this.
Okay. I like it. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I know where it is. But I'll bring it here. I'm gonna show you. It's an amazing place. It's very old. Well, and the castle is actually Walt Disney got his idea to do the castle in Disneyland. based on this castle. But getting back to the castle, in the bedchamber, okay, of the queen, here's the bed, so the bed would be almost not in the middle, but almost sort of in the middle. And there would be people in there all night long. But they had drapes around the bed. So there's no way for anybody to sneak in or anybody to sneak out. So they knew who to protect the bloodline. That's my point.
Yeah.
They had to sleep with people watching them, hearing everything they said, and did. And they had no privacy.
Yeah.
Ever. So it's very, very, very protective of that bloodline, so.
And that carried on through the
Yeah.
court of England too. Yeah, for the wedding night, they always had a crowd. It was just right there. And then when the birth, when the queen gave birth, you know, she had no privacy at all. They had everybody around there to make sure that this was the child that was delivered of this woman, as you say, to
Right.
protect that bloodline.
Well, I thought of another one. Abraham.
Abraham and Sarah.
Yeah, I think
Because
so.
he never took another wife until after Sarah's death.
Yeah.
And there's no talking about a concubine or anything
Right.
until the story with Hagar.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's every indication too that the first time Adam saw Eve, he said, "Wow." He said, "This is terrific." Right. So he was thrilled with that. And I think that's the way God wanted marriage to be. I mean, I think God wants the husband to just be absolutely thrilled and head over heels in love with the wife and vice versa. So yeah, so we do see a degradation of that even with somebody like David. It's a shame. I don't think God intended it to be like that. I think his life would have been a lot better if he had had a wife who was a true mate to him. All right, read on. Sarah, you want to read? Okay. Pastor Tom, you want to read?
Where are we at?
We are at verse 17.
Meanwhile, Abram consulted with the leaders of Israel and reminded them that for a long time they had wanted David as their king. Now's the time, he told them, for the Lord has said, it is David by whom I will save my people from the Philistines and from all their other enemies. Abram also talked to the leaders of the tribe of Benjamin. Then he went to Hebron and reported to David his progress with the people of Israel and Benjamin.
Okay, so we see here that Abner is doing what he told Ishbosheth he was going to do. He's gathering all the people and rallying them towards David.
But has David talked to God about this at all?
Well, it doesn't say specifically. We see a number of times where it says that David sought the Lord. Certain times he does, certain times he doesn't. So I really, that's a good point. I don't know that David is seeking God at this point in time. What we can see, everything that's going on around David, though, we can see God's hand in it because what's happening, and we're going to see here that what God is doing is He is fighting David's battles. God Himself is putting down the potential insurrection. He's doing away with those who would do harm to David in terms of Abner first, and then Ishbosheth, and then others.
He's also building the kingdom.
Yeah, that's right.
Segovia.
Segovia, okay. All right. I'm going to go there sometime. I haven't been there. Okay. Jackie, you want to read next?
And what verse?
I think we're verse 20.
When Abner, who had 20 men with him, came to David at Hebron, David prepared a feast for him and his men. Then Abner said to David, "Let me at once assemble all Israel for my lord the king." So they made a compact with you, and you may rule over all your you may rule over all that your heart desires. So David sent Abner away, and he went in peace. Just then David's men, Joab, returned from the raid that brought with them a great deal of plunder. But Abner was no longer with David in Hebron, because David had sent him away, and he had gone in peace. When Joab and all the soldiers had arrived, he was told Abner, son of Ner, had come to the king, and that the king had sent him away, and that he had gone in peace. So Joab went to the king and said, What have you done? Look, Abner came to you. Why did you let him go? Now he's gone. You know Abner, son of Ner. He came to you to deceive you and observe your movements and find out everything you were doing.
All right, pause right there just a second. All right, so what's going on here? So the plot thickens, the intrigue is building. Joab, who is David's general, he's all fighting a battle. He comes back to Hebron and he finds out that David has met with Abner, right? And he has learned that Abner has come there for the ostensible purpose of telling him, I'm gathering all the people to come and support you. But what does Joab think is going on?
He's gonna be replaced.
Yeah, Joab, the general, thinks that he's going to be replaced by General Abner, so he's not too keen on that. So what does Joab tell David?
And this guy's gonna cause problems and he's just coming to spy.
Exactly. He says, this guy is just a spy, and you just made a big mistake doing what you're doing. So the intrigue builds. All right, read on, verse 26. Juan, do you want to read there?
Joab then left David and sent messengers after Abner, and they brought him back from the well of Sirah. But David did not know it. Now when Abner returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside into the gateway as though to speak with him privately. And there, to avenge the blood of his brother Asahel, Joab stabbed him in the stomach, and he died.
Pause right there just a second. So Joab goes and it's reported that here that he's avenging the blood of his brother because Abner previously killed Asahel. But I think there's maybe a little more sinister motive going on that we just discussed. Joab is jealous of Abner and the alliance that Abner is trying to make with David, but nevertheless he kills him as a matter of revenge, to avenge his blood. What is ironic about that? That avenging taking place in Hebron.
Well, David didn't take Saul's blood.
No, true enough. But remember, Hebron was one of the cities of refuge. So
Yes.
even though Abner was guilty, while he was in Hebron, he was basically on base. Like when we were kids, we played tag. If you get on base, you can't be out. So if you look in Joshua chapter 20, I think verse 7, if my handwriting is correct, then you see that Hebron was one of the cities of refuge. So Abner should have been safe there. But we see, no, even though it was a city of refuge, what Joab does, it's murder. And he evidently was claiming that he did it to revenge his brother, which he had a right to do, but he didn't have a right to do it in Hebron. If he had taken him outside the city gates, sure, he could have killed him there. But as long as Abner was in that city of refuge, he shouldn't have done it. Okay.
Well, it says they were in the gateway, so.
Maybe
Yes,
pushed him out?
Yeah. He was outside the gate when he fell
He said, "Would you
in.
mind standing over here so I can talk?" I don't know. But anyway, that's what happened. All right, read on.
Later, when David heard about this, he said, I and my kingdom are forever innocent before the Lord concerning the blood of Abner, son of Ner. May his blood fall upon the head of Joab and upon all his father's house. May Joab's house never be without someone who has a running sore or leprosy, or who leans on a crutch, or who falls by the sword, or who lacks food. Joab and his brother Abishai murdered Abner because he had killed their brother Asahel in the battle at Gibeon.
So it's interesting here, as soon as David hears about this, again, one of his potential rivals has been killed, but what's David's response to it?
Put a curse on Joab.
Yeah, he says basically, I'm innocent. He said, this blood is not on my hands at all. This blood is on the hands of my surviving nephews. And as you say, he puts a hex on them. He says, may you and your father's house be cursed from this time forevermore. All right, verse 31. Kenny, can you start reading there?
Then David said to Joab and all the people with him, tear your clothes and put on sackcloth and walk in mourning in front of Abner. King David himself walked behind the bier, I guess.
Beer.
Bier, yeah. They buried Abner in Hebron, and the king wept aloud at Abner's tomb All the people wept also. The king sang this lament for Abner. Should Abner have died as the lawless died, your hands were not bound, your feet were not fettered, you fell as one falls before wicked men. And all the people wept over him again. Then they all came and urged David to eat something while it was still day. But David took an oath, saying, May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if I taste bread or anything else before the sun sets. All the people took note and were pleased indeed. Everything the king did pleased them. So on that day all the people and all Israel knew that the king had no part in the murder of Abner, son of Ner.
All right, pause right there. That's a very important thing, that last thing that Kenny read. So all the people of Israel understood that day that it had not been the will of David and that David had no part in the death of Abner. Why is that significant?
Well, because Abner was still part of the other regime of Saul's, and so that let them know that David did not kill Saul, and he did not kill that general either,
Right.
in an attempt to bring the country together.
Right.
That he was still being peaceful
Right.
about the whole thing.
That's
I
right.
think you want to have a clean slate.
Clean slate, yeah.
Yes.
He was letting everybody know that he was still honoring God's will. God had placed Saul where he was, okay? And David, even though Saul was basically a threat to David all of his life, David nevertheless honored that. And David was one who said, I will not lift up my hand against God's anointed. And this even applied to the successors of Saul. So this is important from two aspects. That aspect is very important. That David, he was not lifting up his hand against God's anointed or God's plan. But the other thing is that it's very important to know that David didn't have a hand in this, but God himself was dealing with all of David's enemies, and it is God who is fighting David's battles. Why? Because David is trusting in God. Okay? A very important spiritual lesson for all of us. That God is ready to fight all of our battles as long as what? We put all of our trust in him and are accepting of his will. And it is the desire of our heart that his will be done in our lives. Okay. Let's see, who's next? Kathy, you want to read? Pass. Kim, you want to read or pass?
38.
Yes.
Then the king said to his men, Do you not realize that a prince and a great man has fallen in Israel this day? And today, though I am anointed king, I am weak, and these sons of Zeruiah are too strong for me. May the Lord repay the evildoer according to his evil deeds.
Okay, and make note that in verse 39, Zeruiah is who?
David's sister.
David's sister. And he said, I can't deal with these sons of my sister, my nephews. All right, Kim, pick up in chapter 4, verse 1.
Then Ishbosheth, son of Saul, heard that Abner had died in Hebron. He lost courage, and all Israel became alarmed. Now Saul's son had two men who were leaders of raiding bands. One was named Benaiah and the other Rechab. They were sons of Ramon the Berserite from the tribe of Benjamin. Beer is considered part of Benjamin because the people of Beer fled to Gideon, and they have lived there as aliens to this day. Jonathan, son of Saul, had a son who was lame in both feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel. His nurse picked him up and fled, but as she hurried to leave, he fell and became crippled. His name was
Mephibosheth.
Okay. Now, Rechab.
Pause right there just a second. This is interesting. Some translations say that the nurse fell, but I think the original translation says that he, that is Mephibosheth, fell and became lame. It is said by some scholars that Mephibosheth is a sign or a symbol of fallen man. In other words, what happened to Adam in the garden after he sinned. Humans are referred to as fallen. They are crippled in the sense that what? Their walk with God has been hindered. And it's interesting here that even though Mephibosheth was a direct descendant of Saul, he was his grandson, what we learn later on about Mephibosheth is that his fate is not the same as his father and or his brother or his uncle. What happens to Mephibosheth?
Takes him in.
Yeah, David takes him in, right? So he becomes, he comes under the protection of David. So it's interesting here that what is it that brought about the protection of Mephibosheth, representative of fallen man, crippled man?
He's Jonathan's
David's,
son.
David's oath to Jonathan.
David's oath to Jonathan, that's right. His love. And also I think it comes about as a result of Mephibosheth's recognition of his fallen state. In other words, he didn't try to raise himself up. So he remained humbled by the fall, and so therefore the grace of David brought him in and brought him back into the fold, if you will. All right, verse 5, read on, Kim.
Now Rechab and Benaiah, the sons of Ramon, the Bethrite, set out for the house of Ishbosheth, and they arrived there in the heat of the day while he was taking his noonday rest. They went into the inner part of the house as if to get some wheat in the inner part, and they stabbed him in the stomach. Then Rechab and his brother Benaiah slipped away. They had gone into the house while he was lying on the bed in his bedroom. After they stabbed and killed him, they cut off his head, taking it with them. They traveled all day by way of the Arabah. They brought the head of Ishbosheth to David at Hebron and said to the king, "Here is the head of Ishbosheth, son of Saul, your enemy, who tried to take your life. This day the Lord has avenged my lord the king against Saul and his offspring."
Right, so these two guys, they killed Ishbosheth. They cut off his head. They take his head over to David, saying, "Hey, we've got the head of your enemy right here. Now, can we get our reward?" All right, and so they get their reward, don't they? Nancy, you want to read?
David answered Rechab and his brother Benaiah, the sons of Ramon the Beerothite, "As the Lord lives, who has redeemed my life out of every adversity, when the one who told me, 'See, Saul is dead,' thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and killed him at Ziklag. This was the reward I gave him for his news. How much more then, when wicked men have killed a righteous man on his bed in his own house? And now shall I not require his blood at your hand and destroy you from the earth?" Pause
right there. How is it that David would say that Ishbosheth was a righteous man?
Our version doesn't say righteous, but innocent.
Innocent, okay. Innocent is probably more accurate than righteous. At this point in time, we don't know that Ishbosheth was trying to engage any sort of an insurrection to dethrone David, but nevertheless he was a threat, right? He represents the flesh, who is still a potential threat to the spirit. And so he's killed. But David is not at all pleased with it. So read on, Nancy.
So David commanded the young men, and they killed them. They cut off their hands and feet and hung their bodies beside the pool at Hebron. But the head of Ishbosheth they took and buried in the tomb of Abner at Hebron.
Okay, so once again, David expresses his outrage. Why? Number one, to show that he didn't have any part of it. He is innocent of this. But the other thing, the reason that this is recorded is the same reason we discussed before. To show that David doesn't need to fight. David doesn't need to destroy his enemies. Why? Because God is doing it for him.
But, okay, so David kills these murderers. So he was God's handling David's enemies. So why did he punish them?
Well, and I think it's a part of what David's, basically his creed at the time is that I will not lift up my hand against God's anointed, nor should anyone else. And so the fact that these two men would go against a king and kill a king, and I think David is believing the only reason that Ishbosheth is king is because God put him there. So basically, these two men are going against God's plan.
Also, I mean, I know this isn't following with your flesh and all thing, but you know, if David's showing these guys, this is what you get when you kill a king, isn't he kind of protecting himself?
Well, true enough.
Oh, okay.
I think there's maybe a little bit of a political theme going on.
Okay.
Anybody who kills a king, it's not going to be good.
Okay.
All right, chapter 5. We got time to get to chapter 5?
Got 10 minutes.
We got 10 minutes? All right, we're going to go for it. Johnny, want to read or pass?
Okay.
All right, well, Nancy, why don't you read a bit more?
Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "Look, we are your bone and flesh. For some time, while Saul was king over us, it was you who led out Israel and brought it in. The Lord said to you, 'It is you who shall be shepherd of my people Israel. You who shall be ruler over Israel.' So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel."
All right, pause right there. So, chapter 5, verse 3, David's anointed. How many times has he been anointed so far?
3.
This is his third time. So he's finally anointed. He was first anointed by Samuel. He was then anointed as king over Judah, and now he's anointed as king over all Israel. And it says here he's 30 years old at the time, and he reigned for a total of 40 years. So he died when he was 70 years old. Significant point. Okay, read on, Nancy.
David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. At Hebron he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and at Jerusalem he reigned over all Israel and Judah 33 years. The king and his men marched to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, who said to David, "You will not come in here, even the blind and the lame will turn you back," thinking, "David cannot come in here." Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, which is now the city of David. David had said on that day, "Whoever would strike down the Jebusites, let him get up the water shaft to attack the lame and the blind, those whom David hates." Therefore it is said, "The blind and the lame shall not come into the house." David occupied the stronghold and named it the city of David. David built the city all around from the Millo inward.
All right, pause right there a second. So this is interesting. When David becomes king, he makes Hebron his capital, and he rules there for how long?
3.5 years? 7.
7.5 years.
7.5
That's right.
years.
So he's 7.5 years in Hebron, and then all of a sudden he says, "You know, I'm going to go capture Jerusalem, and I'm going to make Jerusalem my capital." I mean, we all know that Jerusalem is a holy place now, but why would David have been so interested in Jerusalem at the time? Or more specifically, why was God interested in Jerusalem being David's capital?
Zion.
So,
Okay. Well, isn't that what's predicted?
well, let's back up. Up to this point in time, how many times have we encountered Jerusalem in the past?
2 or 3 times.
Okay, there's 2 times.
Melchizedek.
Melchizedek was the king of Salem, which is Jerusalem. And who encountered Melchizedek?
Abraham.
Abraham. So Abraham went there, and what does Melchizedek bring out to David, to Abraham at the time?
Is it bread and
He brings that bread and wine to it, right? And it said that Melchizedek, that Christ himself was a priest after the order of Melchizedek. So he's a very significant guy. That's the first reference to Jerusalem. What's the second reference to Jerusalem? You all know this. What's that? When Abraham took Isaac,
To the mountain.
yeah, where did he take him?
To
That was
the
Jerusalem.
mountain.
That was Jerusalem.
Yeah.
God said, he said, "Take him to a place that I will show you in the region of Moriah." And I believe where he took him was where?
Golgotha?
To Golgotha, yeah. I think that's exactly where Abraham took Isaac. It's the place that looks like, as you can see in the picture up there, there's an outcropping of stone that looks like a skull. It's right here, Golgotha. And you know, the scripture says, I think it's in Genesis chapter 22, that when Abraham was walking through, he raised his eyes and he sees the place. And I think his blood ran cold because it looked like a place of death. And that's where he took it. And Abraham was prepared to sacrifice Isaac right there. But you know the story, God stayed his hand. And he provides a substitute for the death. But Abraham named that place what? Jehovah Jireh. He said, in the mount of the Lord it will be provided. What will be provided? The sacrifice that will save all of mankind, salvation. That the sacrifice will be made that will bring about a right relationship between God and his people. So that's the second reference. So it's interesting here. This is the third reference we have to Jerusalem. And it's very interesting that God has chosen Jerusalem to be the capital of the man after God's own heart. So he takes him to Jerusalem, and he allows him to conquer. In verse 8 it says, how did he get in? The Jebusites, first off, who are the Jebusites?
They are one of the people that they were indigenous to that area.
They were, that's right.
That they were supposed to take out and take control of that area.
Right. And they didn't.
And they did not.
They stuck around. The Jebusites, as you recall, Noah had 3 sons, right? Mm-hmm. Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham had a son by the name of who? Remember, Ham's son was Canaan, and Canaan was the father of the Jebusites and some of the others, okay? So these are Hamite people, but these two are people who represent, the Canaanites were just like Saul, they were people of the flesh. And so this is another example of the Spirit defeating the flesh at this particular place. But it's very interesting, I think, that it said that the Jebusites, they had built their city, their fortress on the hill, and they're so confident that they said, when David's army came in, they said, look, even the blind and the lame among us, we're going to put them up on the battlements. They can fight you off. You'll never get in here. So how does David and get in to win the battle?
Water shaft.
They go through, it says they go through the water shaft or the water tunnel. We don't know exactly what that was, but Jackie and I went near there when we visited Jerusalem. And what it appears to be is a natural place that would have been probably sort of like a storm sewer, like all the rainwater that would have fallen on Mount Zion on the hill up there, it would have drained out, and it was either partially man-made or it was eroded. There's a place where the water would have come out, sort of like a drain. So David's men, they sort of climb up like through a storm sewer, if you will, which is a water tunnel, but I think it's very significant that it's called a water tunnel. Because I'll submit to you that this is the third water tunnel that God's people have gone through to get to this very place. What was the first water tunnel they went through? The Red Sea. What was the second one?
The Jordan.
The River Jordan. Okay? So God's bringing along, and God is finally going to establish his capital at Jerusalem, and he takes David's men in through, not through a gate, not over a wall, but they come in through a water tunnel. Again, signifying how God makes the way, just like God made his way through the Red Sea, through the Jordan, and now he makes a way through the rock, but through the water tunnel for the people to come into.
And what did Hannah go through this morning?
Right.
What's that?
What
Yeah.
did Hannah go through this morning?
Yep, exactly. Oh, and what a great example that is. Yeah, going through the water. You are buried. You are buried with Christ. You are raised to walk in newness of life. Just like when they crossed through the Red Sea, they were buried and they were raised to walk in a new life, right? When they went through the Jordan, they were buried, they were dead. They were raised to walk in newness of life, just like we have the same thing here. Buried in Christ, raised to walk in newness of life. And it's a very interesting thing about Jerusalem as well. Jackie's calling time on me. But while we're focused on this, many significant things happen in Jerusalem, right? The parallel to Melchizedek, when Melchizedek brought out the bread and the wine, where did Jesus have the Lord's Supper? The Last Supper? In Jerusalem. When Abraham took Isaac up to sacrifice him, where did God make the sacrifice? In Jerusalem. When the greatest victory...
Abraham and Isaac, didn't they didn't they do like some kind of, I'm gonna say,
They built
yeah,
an
the altar
altar.
and
Right.
had, I'm gonna say the Lord's Supper. But didn't they do something, Passover or something up
I
there?
don't think so.
They did something up
The,
there.
the significance is the sacrifice, the foreshadowing of the crucifixion there, okay? So we have the Lord's Supper, Melchizedek, we have the crucifixion through Abraham, and then we have David, we have the victory. What is the greatest victory of all time that has occurred so far, that occurred in Jerusalem?
Christ arose from
The resurrection. So again, we have these three parallels in the Old Testament that foreshadow all these marvelous, these amazing things that happen in the New Testament. It's really an incredible thing, the way this scripture is put together.